Hey everybody, and welcome back to Small Group. So glad that you've joined us today, and we're going to be talking about the value of meekness in our lives. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus gives us the third beatitude, and it's in verse 5. Jesus says this, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now, he uses this word meek, and most of us don't like it. Meekness is usually considered weakness, but in Jesus' way of teaching, meekness is not weakness, it is strength under control. The Greek word for meek in verse 5 is prahes, and it's used to describe a horse that is strong but under control. Jesus uses this word to continue his revolutionary teaching. This goes against what the Jews believed. The Jews believed that military might would in fact give them back their land. If you notice in verse 5, it says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." The Jews wanted their land back, and the Jews believed that meekness wouldn't bring that to pass, but that military might would. The historical context will help us to get a better grasp of what Jesus is trying to teach here. He's talking to people that want their land back. The Jews had revolted in 164 BC. We call it the Maccabean Revolt, and they took their land back from the Greeks who had been oppressing them for a long time. And then 63 BC, 100 years later, so the Jews had about 100 years of having their own land. 63 BC, though, not long before Jesus came, a guy named Pompey, under the Roman army, he came and took control of the land. He annexed Palestine, Israel, and took their land. And so Jesus says meekness is the way that you can inherit the land. They were counting on a military leader that would give them victory and run Rome out. And that's not the type of kingdom that Jesus came to set up. Jesus said in the kingdom of heaven, meekness really does matter. So Jesus is saying that the kingdom of heaven, when it's established in a perfect sense on this earth, when the Prince of Peace reigns from Jerusalem, Jesus Christ himself, he says, then the meek will really inherit the earth. And this is a promise that we have to look forward to. And while that is an amazing promise, Jesus also wants to teach us some practical life lessons about meekness. And he is saying that meekness is greater than might. Practically speaking, as parents, we can learn this. And we should learn this, that when we're talking to our children in a meek way, they hear us a lot better than when we're talking to them in a loud, powerful, mighty way. Because as soon as you start getting loud with this big voice, your kids shut down. All they hear is that you're screaming and that you're mad, and they fail to process what you're trying to teach them. So instead of screaming at them, sit down with them and be meek with them when you're talking to them and you're trying to correct them. Same thing is true with customer service agents. Have you ever tried to get your way by being really forceful and mighty? And it really does sometimes turn them off, and it doesn't help at all. But if you will be meek and explain your situation, then a lot of times you get better customer service that way. This is true with your spouse. When you're dealing with them, if you come across in a overbearing, forceful tone, then you're not going to be heard very well. But if you will be meek and approach them in a tender, compassionate, kind, respectful way, you'll be able to get your point across much better. This teaching from Jesus on meekness shouldn't have been altogether a shocker for the Jews. Jesus was actually quoting the Old Testament, and he quotes Psalm 37:11, "But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace." So the Old Testament taught about meekness, and now Jesus teaches about meekness as well. This reference by Jesus to the Old Testament actually leads us to believe that Jesus really does value the Old Testament. In fact, if you look at Jesus' teaching, there are 64 direct references to Old Testament scriptures. He actually quoted from 14 different books in the Old Testament, and it helps us to realize the value of the Old Testament. In fact, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, same chapter, verse 17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." Those are both references to the Old Testament. He says, "I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Jesus was the fulfillment of the Old Testament law and the prophets, and because he was able to fulfill all of the law, we are no longer bound by the Old Testament ceremonial law, which is the sacrificial system, and we're no longer bound by the civil law of the Old Testament, which was the judicial system for the Jews. So here are some overall big picture blessings from the Old Testament. For instance, in the Old Testament, it was constant foreshadowing of Jesus. So when we read the Old Testament, it's great because we get little glimpses of what Jesus would be like when he did come to this earth. Not only was there foreshadowing, but there were actual foretellings about Jesus, prophecies, hundreds of them describing what Jesus would be like. And so the Old Testament is really valuable and important because every bit of it is about Jesus Christ. On every page, as you read the Old Testament, be searching for Jesus, and this will help you as you study the Old Testament. In Matthew 5, verse 20, Jesus continues to teach us about this concept of Old Testament versus New Testament, and he says in verse 20, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter to the kingdom of heaven." The idea is that the Old Testament was what the scribes and Pharisees were trying to do. They were trying to live up to this Old Testament law in order to earn their salvation and to have right standing before God, but they were not able to. Their righteousness was not good enough, Jesus says. He says, your righteousness has to be better than the Pharisees. And just to let you know, the Pharisees, they even made up laws so that they could not break God's law. And the problem was they made those laws on the same level as God's laws. They did things like they would put a mask over their face so that they, as they walked down the highway or the road, in case there was an attractive lady, they would cover their face with that so that they wouldn't lust. And there were a certain amount of steps that they would only take on the Sabbath day so that they wouldn't do too much work or too much walking, which would be considered working on the Sabbath day. So they were really serious about keeping the Old Testament law, and they weren't good enough. And so what we learn from this is Jesus is saying, no matter how hard you try, you could not be good enough. You can only have your righteousness through imputed righteousness, which comes through faith in Jesus Christ alone. That's the only way. If we believe in Jesus, when God the Father looks down on us, he doesn't see the dirty sinners that we are and the shortcomings that we have. He sees the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And that's the beauty of the New Testament. So the Old Testament even talks about how valuable meekness is. Jesus certainly states the value of meekness. And the New Testament reiterates multiple places how valuable meekness is. For instance, there are two very valuable lists that we have in the New Testament. One would be the fruit of the Spirit, and meekness is mentioned there as gentleness, a synonym. And then here in the Beatitudes, this wonderful list of how to be happy according to Jesus. We learn that we can be happy, happy, happy through meekness. Now, however, this world that we live in does not appreciate meekness very much. In fact, it is countercultural to say meekness is really valuable. In fact, I want to read what one writer wrote about this meekness as far as the way our culture views meekness. He says, meekness, let's admit it, we don't like the word. It tastes insipid. It smells like morning mouth. It has the strength of a cooked noodle. Coaches don't rally teams with meekness. Executives don't send salespeople into the field with it. And politicians don't promise to lead by it. Parents don't counsel their children on how to develop meekness. Generals don't embolden troops with a speech on meekness. You won't find anyone offering seminars on meekness training. It probably should be examined by a House committee on un-American activities, is what he had to say about it. Jesus makes a statement about meekness, and it's so strong, and it flies in the face of our culture. Culture says this, and I've got just some contrast that I want to go through about this idea of meekness. Culture says this: believe in yourself. Jesus says, believe in me. So what we're going to see in this contrast is that Jesus makes this statement in the Beatitudes early on in his ministry, and then he continues to carry out that teaching throughout all of his teachings. And here are some examples of how he carries on that thought accordingly about meekness throughout his ministry. He says, of course, believe in yourself is what culture says, but Jesus says, believe in me. Another contrast would be culture says, don't get mad, get even. And Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those that despitefully use you. Another cultural statement would be, strive to be number one. And Jesus said, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. The world says, culture says, Winning is not everything, it's the only thing. Jesus said, "He who finds his life shall lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake shall find it." Another contrast would be, stand up for your rights. We hear that a lot. But Jesus said, lay down your life because it's not about you anyway. It's all about Jesus, and the call to Christ is a call to meekness. So it's really obvious that Jesus' teaching on meekness is in direct contrast with the way that the world looks at it today. So before we go today, let's recap the teaching on meekness from Sunday, just a portion of it that says, why do we need meekness anyway? What are the benefits from meekness? Number one, it helps us to respond to difficult people. In Proverbs 15:1, it says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger." And if we're gentle, meek, power under control, then we're able to respond to difficult people in the right way. Secondly, meekness will help us to receive God's word. This is what James chapter 1 verse 21 says. It requires meekness to be able to be obedient to what the scriptures teach us. We say, I'm going to submit underneath the authority of God's word, and I'm going to do what God says. Number three, meekness helps us to restore people who mess up. Galatians 6:1 says, be careful that you restore people in a kind, gentle, meek way, because it could be you that messes up next time. Number four, meekness helps us to remain unified. And we need unity in the church so we can accomplish God's mission. And all of us being meek together helps us to have unity. Ephesians 4 verses 2 and 3 will help you as you look at that in your group. Thank you so much for coming out to small group today. I hope you'll take a few moments and discuss this together. God bless you. We'll see you right back here next week.